I didn't stop sleeping because I was afraid. That's the detail people usually get wrong. Fear implies a reaction to something that announces itself, a threat, a noise, an image, a thought you can point to afterward and say, that was it. What I was dealing with never did that. It didn't interrupt my sleep or invade it. It didn't follow me into dreams. If anything, sleep remained the safest part of the night. That was the problem. Sleep felt misplaced, like stepping away from something at the wrong moment. Even though nothing seemed to be happening yet, I didn't feel chased out of rest. I felt like rest was no longer aligned with the sequence of things as they were actually unfolding. At the time, I wouldn't have described it that way. I didn't have the language for it yet. All I knew was that waking up felt cleaner than falling asleep, and that distinction didn't sit right. Nothing was wrong. That's important to say up front. Nothing in my life suggested that I should have been on edge or hyper-aware of the night. I lived alone in a small apartment in the US, in a city that liked to think of itself as busy, but quieted down early if you paid attention. I worked remotely, mostly late hours, mostly unsupervised. My schedule was flexible enough that days blended into each other without friction. Some nights I slept early. Some nights I didn't. It had been that way for years. I wasn't depressed. I wasn't overworked. I wasn't going through anything I would later recognize as a trigger. My health was fine. My routines were unremarkable. I cooked simple meals. I exercised just enough to feel responsible. I answered messages late and emails later. My life had the kind of loose stability that makes time pass without ceremony. At night, the apartment behaved the way apartments always do. The refrigerator hummed softly. The building carried sound in long, indirect ways. Footsteps above me, plumbing below. A door closing somewhere down the hall hours before it would matter to me. Outside, traffic stitched itself together out of long pauses and brief surges. I'd gotten used to the city's rhythm years ago. It never surprised me. Nothing was wrong. That's why the first disturbance took so long to register as one. The first time it happened, I didn't wake up in panic. I didn't wake up suddenly, or with my heart racing, or with the sensation that something had pulled me out of sleep. My eyes opened the way they do when you've slept enough, even if you didn't plan to. No grogginess, no confusion, no lingering dream to shake off. The room was dark but familiar, not unfamiliar, not distorted, just already there. For a few seconds, I stayed still, letting my awareness settle into the space. That pause felt natural, unforced. I wasn't listening for anything in particular. I wasn't checking myself for anxiety. I was simply present in the room, the way you are when you wake up in a place you know well. What stood out wasn't what I noticed. It was what I didn't. There was no sense of transition. Usually, waking up carries a trace of movement, a feeling of crossing from one state into another. Even when it's subtle, you can sense the shift. The mind catching up to the body adjusting to gravity, the room gradually reasserting itself. This time, none of that happened. It felt like I had arrived somewhere that was already fully assembled. I checked the time after a moment, not because I felt compelled to, but because it seemed like the next logical step. The clock read to 7 a.m. That alone meant nothing. People wake up at odd hours all the time. Sleep cycles drift. Bodies misalign. I'd done late nights for years without thinking twice about it. If I'd woken up at 17 once and gone back to sleep, I would never have remembered it. What stayed with me was the feeling that something had already concluded before I became aware of it. It didn't feel like something happened. It felt like something had already finished. There was no emotion attached to that thought. No fear, no curiosity strong enough to linger. I lay there for another minute or two, then rolled over and went back to sleep. The night resumed without resistance. The next morning was unremarkable. The day passed the way days usually do. I worked, answered messages, ate, moved through the apartment without thinking about it. The memory of waking up felt thin, like something that would dissolve if I tried to hold on to it too tightly. But the following night, it happened again. Same pattern. Clean wake up. No alarm. No anxiety. The room already in place. The same quiet sense of arrival. This time, I noticed the familiarity of it before I noticed the time. When I checked the clock, it was 2:17 a.m. Again. I didn't react. I didn't sit up. I didn't start scanning the room for anything out of place. I lay there and waited for a feeling to catch up to the situation. Surprise, concern, even mild interest. None of them did. The thought that formed instead was practical. That's odd. Not alarming. Not ominous. Just odd. Over the next few nights, the pattern repeated. Not every night at first. Enough to be noticeable, not enough to feel decisive. Each time, the wake-up felt the same. Smooth, neutral, complete. Each time, the clock landed within a minute of 2:17. Once it was 2:16. Once, 2:18. Close enough that the variation felt mechanical, rather than random. I started paying attention, but casually. The way you pay attention to a new sound in your building that hasn't decided whether it's a problem yet. I told myself it was nothing. I believed that. Rational explanations lined up easily. Circadian rhythm made sense. Bodies are good at learning timing, even without conscious reinforcement. Conditioning explained a lot. If something subtle happened at the same time more than once, it wasn't strange that my sleep would begin to adjust on it. Stress adaptation fit too. Late work, inconsistent rest, screen exposure. None of it felt like a stretch. What didn't fit was how little effort the adjustment seemed to require. I wasn't tired when I woke up. I wasn't restless. I didn't negotiate with myself about whether to go back to sleep. I simply woke up and remained awake, as though that were the default state at that hour. When I did fall back asleep, it happened without resistance, like stepping out of a room you hadn't meant to linger in. I started noticing something else as well. The sensation of the room. It's difficult to describe without making it sound dramatic, which it wasn't. The room didn't change. The furniture didn't look different. The lighting remained the same. What shifted was the sense of completion. The space felt settled, as if whatever configuration it reached during the night had already locked itself in. Before I became aware of it, there was no sense of anticipation in the air. No build-up. No waiting. That was when sleep began to feel out of place. I didn't think of it as avoidance at first. I didn't decide to stop sleeping. I just delayed it. I stayed up a little later than usual, scrolling longer, finishing work that could have waited until morning, letting myself drift through the apartment without urgency. When I finally lay down, it was closer to 2 a.m. than I would have liked. I woke up anyway. Same clean wake-up. Same quiet arrival, same time. That night, instead of going back to sleep, I stayed awake. Not because I expected anything to happen. I wasn't waiting for a sound, or an image, or a sensation to intensify. I just wanted to see what the night felt like if I didn't step away from it. What I noticed first was absence, not of sound, but of hierarchy. The refrigerator still hummed. Traffic still passed outside. The building still carried its usual noises, but they no longer ranged themselves into foreground and background. Everything arrived at the same distance, equally present, equally unimportant. The air felt neutral, not cold, not stale, just unresistant, as if it no longer pressed back when I breathed. I checked the clock. 2:17 a.m. Nothing happened. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. It wasn't unsettling either. It was simply definitive. The moment passed without ceremony. Sound regained its structure. Space unfolded again. The room returned to itself without hesitation. I was left sitting on the edge of the bed, awake, calm, and aware that nothing new had occurred, except that I hadn't slept through it. Over the next several nights, I began to test the pattern in small, reasonable ways. I went to bed earlier. I cut caffeine earlier in the day. I left my phone in another room. I told myself I was resetting my schedule, even though I didn't feel particularly off to begin with. I still woke up. I tried the opposite approach. I stayed up much later, pushing past the usual time, so that sleep would be deeper when it arrived. One night, I fell asleep close to 1:30 a.m., heavy and unbroken. I woke up at 2:16. No alarm, no anxiety, no sense of interruption. The room was already settled. Each time, the same quiet discrepancy emerged. When I slept through the night, I woke up with a vague sense that something had completed without me. Not missed, completed. When I stayed awake, the night felt unfinished until the moment passed. There was no emotion attached to that realization. No fear of consequence. No imagined threat. Just an internal misalignment that didn't resolve on its own. I began to understand, slowly, that staying awake didn't feel like watching. Watching implies attention, vigilance, expectation. What I felt contained none of that. Staying awake felt closer to not leaving at the wrong moment. Like remaining in a room because stepping out would disrupt a process you didn't need to understand. In order to respect. I didn't stop sleeping all at once. I drifted into wakefulness earlier and earlier, without intention. My body adjusted ahead of my thoughts. Stillness arrived sooner. Awareness widened without focusing on anything in particular. I didn't brace myself. I didn't prepare. I simply remained. Nothing about the experience asked to be dramatized. If I tried to explain it to someone else, it would have sounded like a non-issue. People wake up. Bodies adapt. Nights pass. But repetition has weight. By the end of that first stretch, I couldn't tell you how many nights it had been. One thing had become clear. Sleep wasn't dangerous. It wasn't even disruptive. It was just beside the point. Avoiding sleep didn't feel like a solution. It felt like a temporary alignment. A way of staying in step with something that hadn't asked for my attention, but seemed to notice my absence. I didn't know what came next. I only knew that, for now, staying awake felt like the least incorrect option, and that was enough to keep me there. I didn't decide to stay awake forever. That's the part that still feels important to clarify. There was no moment where I sat on the edge of the bed and told myself, this is what I do now. No commitment, no resolve, no sense of sacrifice. Sleep remained available the entire time. I could close my eyes whenever I wanted. My body never resisted rest. Nothing punished me for choosing it. That was what made the shift difficult to name. Because what changed wasn't my ability to sleep. It was the relevance of doing so. At first, staying awake felt temporary. An experiment stretched across a few nights. I told myself I was gathering information, even though I didn't know what kind of information I expected to find. I wasn't waiting for escalation. I wasn't hoping the moment would grow stronger or reveal something hidden inside it. If anything, I expected it to fade once I stopped paying attention. It didn't. What changed instead was the night on it. I began noticing the preparation earlier than before, not always at the same interval. Sometimes 15 minutes ahead, sometimes less, but always in the same order. The air would thin first, not in a way that suggested temperature or pressure, but resistance. Breathing felt easier, not deeper, as if the space no longer pressed back when I occupied it. Then sound would loosen, not silence. Silence would have been too obvious, too dramatic. What happened instead was a loss of structure. The apartment has a familiar nighttime hierarchy, distant traffic as background, the refrigerator as a steady anchor, occasional building noises punctuating the gaps. On these nights, that structure dissolved. Everything arrived on the same plane. Noise without priority, presence without emphasis. I'd notice it while doing something ordinary, brushing my teeth, rinsing a dish, scrolling through emails, and realize that the room already felt flatter than it had minutes ago. The sensation didn't demand attention. It didn't interrupt me. It simply existed. The way humidity exists, or altitude. Light followed last, not dimming exactly. Contrast drained out of it. Edges softened. Shadows lost their purpose. Lamps still illuminated. Screens still glowed. The room looked complete without insisting on detail. Depth became optional. By the time I checked the clock, I already knew where it was headed. to 17a. The moment itself never changed. It didn't intensify with familiarity. It didn't respond to my awareness of it. Space held. Sound compressed. My body adjusted in the same small, efficient ways it always had, shoulders lowering, breath slowing, posture settling without instruction. Seconds passed. Then the room resumed its depth. What was different now was what happened afterward. In the beginning, the night reset. The alignment passed, and the apartment returned fully to itself. Sound reorganized. Air thickened. Light reclaimed contrast. It felt like a brief interruption in an otherwise stable environment. That stopped happening. The preparation no longer felt like a response to the moment. It felt like maintenance already underway. When the alignment passed, nothing snapped back into place. The night remained in that softened state, as though the adjustment had not been temporary at all. I didn't react to this shift emotionally. No fear arrived. No excitement. What I felt instead was distance. A subtle separation between the version of myself who had once moved through nights, without noticing them, and the version now standing inside one that no longer behaved the same way. I tried to disrupt it. I went to bed earlier for several nights in a row. No screens. No work past a reasonable hour. I treated sleep like something that could be stabilized if approached correctly. My body accepted rest easily. I slept deeply. I still woke up. Not abruptly. Not with confusion. Just awake enough to notice that the air had already thinned. I tried staying busy late into the night. I filled the hours with tasks that demanded attention. Cleaning, reorganizing, finishing work I'd been postponing. I told myself exhaustion would override whatever pattern had formed. It didn't. I would feel the shift while still moving, still engaged. The room would lose its hierarchy around me. My posture would soften mid-task. I'd slow without deciding to. Forcing exhaustion didn't help either. I exercised late. I let my body burn through energy until fatigue felt undeniable. Sleep came quickly, heavily, and still. Sometime before 2:17, awareness would rise to the surface. Light sleep. Open eyes. The same quiet readiness. None of this felt like failure. That was the unsettling part. My body didn't behave as though something were wrong. There was no internal protest, no stress response, no sense of disruption. The cooperation came without instruction, as if this was simply the most efficient way to exist at that hour. That's when I stopped thinking of the moment as something that happened. It felt more accurate to think of it as something the night was already arranged for. The preparation didn't accelerate when I paid attention. It didn't fade when I didn't. The air didn't thin for me. Sound didn't flatten because I was awake. These changes arrived on schedule, indifferent to my awareness of them. I realized then that awareness was secondary. Continuity mattered more. That idea created a subtle destabilization. Not fear. Fear still had no place here. But displacement. The sense that I was no longer standing apart from the pattern, observing it repeat. I was inside it. The night didn't seem to wait for me anymore. It didn't arrive and then adjust. It behaved as though the conditions were already in place, whether or not I was ready to acknowledge them. Resistance never registered. I could stay awake or sleep. I could be focused or distracted. The preparation stretched backward all the same, unbothered by my attempts to interfere. One night, lying awake in the dark, already still, already aligned, I understood the shift clearly enough to name it. The moment wasn't arriving anymore. It was being met. That understanding didn't bring clarity or relief. It created distance, a subtle separation between who I thought I was in the night and what the night now assumed I would be. Fear still didn't appear, but the space where fear might have lived no longer felt close enough to reach. I could sleep through it. I proved that to myself. On nights when exhaustion finally pulled me under just far enough, I missed the exact second of alignment. I'd wake afterward with the same sense of completion in the room. The same flattened quiet already settling back into depth. Nothing escalated when I wasn't there to witness it. And yet, something felt unfinished. Not wrong. Not dangerous. Just incomplete. The way a process feels when one of its regular conditions isn't met. There was no imagined consequence attached to that realization. Just the awareness that absence mattered, even if nothing reacted to it. That was when staying awake stopped feeling like vigilance. It wasn't watching anymore. It felt closer to maintenance. Being present so that nothing had to adjust down a gap. I didn't frame it that way consciously. There was no decision point, no internal declaration. The shift happened quietly. The way habits form when they no longer need reinforcement. Evenings began to simplify on their own. I avoided starting things that would carry momentum past the night. Conversations ended earlier. Work tapered instead of stopping abruptly. Screens dimmed. Sounds softened. Not because I was preparing for the moment. Because preparation was already happening without me. By the time I noticed, the night felt balanced before it arrived at its familiar point. I understood then that awareness was no longer central. The night didn't need my attention. It didn't improve when I focused on it or weaken when I didn't. Presence mattered. Observation did not. That distinction changed everything. There was no fear of consequence if I stopped. I never imagined something breaking, retaliating, or collapsing. The imbalance I sensed wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. The way you know a system will behave differently if one variable is removed. Even if the difference is barely perceptible. Staying awake wasn't compulsive. It felt practical. Like leaving a machine running because shutting it down would serve no purpose. Like remaining in place because movement would introduce friction without benefit. Sleep stayed possible the entire time. I could lie down at any point and let it take me. Nothing would intervene. Nothing would follow. Sleep simply stopped being relevant. What mattered was continuity. Return. The night didn't feel alive, or aware, or intentional in any way that implied an observer. There was no presence watching, no intelligence waiting. The moment felt structural, part of how the night held its shape, briefly and precisely, before releasing it again. Upkeep, not invasion. Alignment, not intrusion. By the end of this stretch, I no longer thought in terms of what comes next. I thought in terms of what must not be skipped, and that realization settled in quietly, without urgency. As though it had been true long before I noticed it. At some point, I stopped thinking of staying awake as something I was doing. That shift didn't arrive with clarity. There was no insight that rearranged everything at once. No sentence I could point to and say, that's when it changed. What happened instead was quieter, and because of that, harder to resist. The night stopped feeling like a sequence of events. It began to feel like a condition. I noticed it first in the way evenings no longer opened outward. Time used to stretch after sunset. Options existed. I could work late, call someone, start something that would pull me forward. Even when I didn't act on those options, they were present, available, waiting. That availability faded. Not abruptly. Not in a way that suggested restriction. The night simply narrowed itself. Activities lost momentum faster. Decisions resolved before I finished considering them. Conversations reached natural endings earlier than they used to, without discomfort or apology. Nothing was taken away. It just stopped offering itself. By the time darkness fully settled, the night already felt arranged, balanced, as though its shape had been set in advance, and my role within it was not to alter that shape, but to occupy a specific position inside it. I stopped telling myself I was choosing to remain awake. Choice implies alternatives that matter equally. This didn't feel like that. Sleep remained possible. I could lie down, close my eyes, and drift under whenever I wanted. My body still recognized fatigue. Dreams still came when I let them. But sleeping felt beside the point. The moment at 2:17 a.m. still occurred whether I noticed it or not. I had proven that. The night did not depend on my attention. It did not escalate when I was present or collapse when I wasn't. And yet, absence continued to feel noticeable. Not punished. Not corrected. Just registered. Like a system compensating quietly when one of its regular conditions isn't met. Nothing breaks. Nothing alerts you. But the balance shifts in ways that are too precise to ignore once you've learned their shape. That was when routine reframed itself. Staying awake stopped feeling like vigilance. I wasn't watching for anything. I wasn't monitoring changes or bracing for escalation. There was no tension in it, no sense of guarding against an outcome. It felt closer to upkeep. Maintenance is invisible when it's done correctly. Nothing announces itself. Nothing improves dramatically. The only sign of success is continuity. That's what presence became. Not observation. Presence. I began to understand that the night did not want awareness. It did not reward attention. If anything, the tension felt irrelevant. An extra layer that added friction without benefit. What mattered was alignment. Return. The way something resumes its exact position after being briefly displaced. The moment itself remained unchanged. Space held. Sound compressed. My body adjusted in the same small, efficient ways it always had. Seconds passed. The room released its depth again. But the night no longer reset. It continued. The flattened quiet didn't fully withdraw. The hierarchy of sound remained loose. Light stayed soft, contrast optional. The atmosphere felt complete, without insisting on resolution. It was then that I realized something else. The night didn't feel like it was ending anymore. It used to. Even late nights carried a sense of eventual release, morning as punctuation, sleep as a boundary, a point where things stopped accumulating and began again. That boundary eroded, not because time stopped moving, but because the night no longer behaved as a passage. It behaved as a state that simply extended itself forward. Morning still arrived. Light returned. The city resumed its rhythms. None of that disappeared. But the night didn't feel concluded by it. It felt carried through. That was the most unsettling realization of all. And still, fear did not appear. There was no dread attached to it. No anticipation of harm. Just the awareness that something had shifted from being episodic to being structural. The pattern did not belong to my apartment. I learned that when I stayed elsewhere. Different rooms. Different buildings. The same brief alignment. The same sense of completion afterward. Walls were interchangeable. Furniture was irrelevant. The pattern didn't belong to place. It didn't belong to the hour either. Not in the way clocks usually matter. The timing remained exact, but it carried no symbolism. There was nothing special about 2:17 a.m. It functioned like a coordinate, a point the night returned to because it always had. And it wasn't insomnia. That became undeniable once I stopped framing sleep as something I was resisting. When I lay down, rest still came. Fatigue behaved normally. Dreams arrived when invited. Sleep simply stopped serving a purpose in the structure that had formed. That understanding settled in without drama. I didn't grieve the loss of something. I didn't feel deprived. The language of sacrifice didn't apply. Nothing had been taken. What changed was relevance. Staying awake felt necessary in the same way leaving a system running feels necessary. Not because stopping it would cause damage, but because stopping it would introduce a gap where none was needed. No one was watching. Nothing was enforcing this. There was no sense of being assigned a role. And yet, regularity mattered. The night did not feel alive, or aware, or intentional in any way that implied an observer. There was no presence waiting, no intelligence tracking my behavior. The moment felt structural, a brief alignment that allowed the night to hold its shape. Upkeep, not invasion. Continuation, not demand. Tonight is no different. I'm already awake. Not because I'm waiting for something to happen. Not because I'm afraid of what comes next. The familiar thinning has begun. Sound is loosening its hierarchy. Light is losing contrast in ways I no longer evaluate. The minute will pass. Nothing will change. And I will remain. Not out of resistance. Not out of choice. But because this is how the night continues.